You're listening to the Write Project podcast and radio program, a show about writing and modern Newfoundland author culture. This program is produced and recorded at CHMR FM 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is aired on other great stations in the province and elsewhere in the country. It can also be heard online at www.chmr.ca. I'm your host, Matthew Ledrew. Hello, and thank you for tuning into the Write Project podcast on CHMR. We've got a special episode for you today. We've got Hannah Jenkins in the hot seat here. She'll be answering the most asked questions of any author. Hannah Jenkins is one of the authors from Mythology from the Rock and is the masterclass poet behind The Birds Come Back in the Spring, releasing in 2022 from Engine Books. Thank you for joining us, Hannah. So Hannah, I've got a bunch of questions that people just are dying to hear your answers to, because you're an interesting enigma in the writing community right now. Hannah Jenkins, how many unpublished or half-finished books do you have?
That's a good question. I have like some short stories and stuff and like individual poems. But in terms of like larger collections, I would say like 3 other ones. So I have a collection that is part poetry, part short story, and it's all actually mythology based. So it kind of relates to Mythology from the Rock.
That's why you submitted to that. Okay. Gotcha.
Actually, that one was written for Mythology from the Rock.
Wow.
But I've sort of over just the years kind of been adding to this this collection, and it's the whole idea is to kind of rewrite stories, especially female narratives, to kind of give them more voice and more autonomy and agency. Because I find a lot of religions and mythologies their stories tend to be very male dominated.
Sure.
So I've been trying to get some things out for that, and hopefully get something completed sometime in the future. I have a series. Well, it's not a series yet. That is the goal. The goal is to make it multi-books, sort of like a futuristic sci-fi superhero thing going on.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like for it to be a graphic novel series, but like I have no artistic talent. But that is the goal.
Beautiful. That's wonderful. Well, that's amazing. I love how like so many different interests you have. It's crazy. I love it.
Thanks.
Hannah Jenkins, do you ever hide secrets in your stories that only a few people will ever find?
I don't think I have enough published to really say that I've hidden secrets. I think that in stuff that I have brewing, I definitely create certain, whether that be like names of places or like little, I guess it's a hard balance between like what is foreshadowing and what is a secret and what is like Easter egg. But I definitely kind of want to connect this book series that I'm envisioning in a lot of subtle ways. So I can't say that I have a ton right now, but
Sure.
The more I publish, the more I'm hoping to kind of reference other things in it. So
Awesome. Okay. Love it. How many hours a day do you write, Hannah Jenkins?
If I'm in a writing mood, several hours. If I'm not in a writing mood, none.
That's fair.
Yeah, it depends on the day. Absolutely.
Cool. Sounds great. Yeah. Life's too short to do stuff that you don't want to do.
Yeah.
Yep.
Unless it's a deadline.
Yep. Unless it's a deadline, at which point how I feel can go away. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hannah Jenkins, what is the most difficult part of your artistic process?
Like I mentioned in a different question, I really struggle with plot, and I really struggle with making everything coherent in one story. So I have ideas and I have like moments and scenes, and I want to write those scenes, but I don't want to write the things that build up to that scene because I'm worried that they're going to be long or they're going to be boring or they're going to drag out. So, for example, beginnings, I don't like beginnings. I don't like starting things. And I don't like, I like endings actually, but I don't like I don't like the things that build up
Okay.
to major events. I just want to write the major events in the story, and then I'm like, oh, you need development. What is this? You don't just know what I mean. You don't just know why this happened. I have to explain it.
That's fair. Yeah. That is the board. I get the feeling when I'm in doing writing classes, I divide things up in terms of acts, usually 3 acts. That's the structure that I live in. And I kind of have this theory that when most writers conceptualize a story, like when you think about it, you're thinking of act 2. Like that's when all the fun is. Like there's the setup, that's act 1, and then there's the cleanup where it's like, oh, I gotta clean up after the mess I made. But act 2 is where you get to play with your toys. Like act 1 is taking out the toys, act 3 is putting them away because mom made you. But like act 2, that's when you get to like play. And that's what I think authors think of when they first conceptualize the story.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Yeah. So much fun. So many toys.
I
know. Hannah Jenkins, what is an early experience that you personally had where you learned that language has power?
I think I kind of grew up around a lot of writing. Both my parents are Salvation Army officers, so they preach every week, and I was raised in a church, essentially, and I was raised on sermons. My grandfather also was a journalist and a poet, and I just kind of grew up around, especially from a religious standpoint, the idea that what you preach, quite literally in this case, preach is what people absorb. So they're almost kind of teaching in a way. So I think I grew up with the understanding that, since I was born, that words matter, and like how you present something matters, and how you interpret something matters. So there's so many different ways. So in a Christian religion, there's so many different ways to interpret the Bible, for example.
Sure.
So depending on what denomination you go to, you're going to get so many iterations of that. And I was so conscious of that from a very young age, that there's so many different ways you can interpret this. So it matters how you interpret it, and matters how you respond to that, and how you tell other people about it. So
interesting. Cool. I like that. Hannah Jenkins, what does literary success or success in this industry look like to you? Like when you're like, ooh, I'll be successful then. And just so you know, every author moves the goalpost. Authors are never happy. So whatever you're conceptualizing as, ooh, I'll be successful when this happens, the second you achieve it, you will move the goalpost, because that's what writers do. but right now, what is your concept of success in this industry? What is your goalpost?
I think, as much as it's probably not always the healthiest thing, do you think? I think sales kind of matter, and things like awards. And so just because somebody read something doesn't necessarily mean that they liked it, and doesn't necessarily mean that it was good. So when you get things like reviews, positive reviews, and if you get like award, even nominations, or shortlisting and stuff like that, let alone if you win it.
There you go.
So basically anything that, sales are great, and I definitely think that it's awesome that I'm a bestseller, and that would be amazing to have that title. Sure. But even more so, I think like award winning, if I had to pick between the two, even if it was sort of an underground book or something, but it did really well with that audience, I think would be more satisfying and feel like more of a success than have, thousands and thousands of people read it and like nobody really responded. It didn't really affect anyone. It didn't make anybody feel anything.
That's fair. I like that. Yeah, that's fair. Definitely you want to have your stuff affect people. You know what I mean? Yeah, absolutely. Hannah Jenkins, do you view writing as a kind of spiritual practice?
Yeah, I would say that. I think spiritual is it's a word up for a lot of interpretation.
Yep.
So I definitely think it's something therapeutic for me. I think it's something that makes me feel connected to other people and to other events. So like in that sense, absolutely, I think it's very important. And I respect it a lot, and I don't go into things lightly in that sense. Like you can play around with things lightly, obviously, but I'm always very conscious of what I write, in the sense of I don't want to, like sensitivity raters, for example, are such a great thing that are becoming more popular. So when you create something that might feel very great and therapeutic for you, you got to be careful that you're not creating something that's negatively affecting somebody else.
That's fair.
Kind of a tangent, but yes.
No, that's fair. That is very, very fair. Actually, that's an excellent segue into Hannah Jenkins. In your opinion, what are the ethics of writing about historical figures?
Ooh, I have a lot of opinions about historical fiction.
Okay.
And they're complicated opinions and emotions. But I think that if you are proposing that this is, for example, like a biopic, if you're proposing that this is a real thing that happened, I think you have to be so careful. I think you have to do so much research and really care about what you're doing, because this is a real person who existed. This was a real event that probably affected a lot of people, and that even if it happened ages ago to us, there is going to be somebody who's living with the repercussions of that, whether that be generational trauma or what have you. So it's so important to respect that, especially if it is a traumatic event. So, but then on the other hand, if you're like, oh, I'm just setting it in this time period, and you maybe interact with this person who is a historical figure, maybe there's a bit more leeway. I personally kind of hate this idea or this trend of turning historical figures into like just people that they really weren't, just because it's more palatable to what we kind of our morals in our society now. Maybe hate's a strong word. I have mixed feelings about it. Like, for example, controversial. This isn't controversial. I love Hamilton as a musical.
Sure.
I think it's lyrically, musically, it's absolutely brilliant. I think I watched the filmed version, and choreography and everything, fantastic. It's one of the best musicals I've ever seen. But when you look at the fact that these were historical figures who really lived and really owned slaves, for example, and that's rarely touched on and is actually kind of used as like Easter eggs throughout like Thomas Jefferson mentions his slave Sally, who I think I understand why a lot of people are kind of coming back at that play now, and I personally have so many mixed emotions about it, because I think technically, yes, great, phenomenal musical, but the repercussions of how you portray slave owners, for example, I understand why there are so many people pushing back.
I do too. I actually have yet to see that musical. I'm not like into that scene very much kind of thing, but like a lot of people that I know have talked about it and how wonderful it is. I was watching this interesting essay on it, like a video essay about it, and it's interesting because like that question of, because I think there's two sides to history, and I don't mean like in the like two-sidesing it kind of way. I mean, when you're telling history, there's two ways to do it. There's I'm going to call it the Sesame Street version of it that's for kids, you know what I mean? And then there's the more grown-up version of it where it's like I can't, like, some of the founding fathers did of the United States did horrible things. One of them raped somebody, like there's like, if you're doing the Sesame Street version where you're just learning their names and learning like them in order, like, oh, this was the 14th president, and you're learning that part of history, it's fine to leave that out because there's 6. But like, if you get past the high school level and you're leaving out the terrible stuff that they also did, you're kind of doing a disservice, like there's a point to leave the cookie cutter Sesame Street version of history behind,
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I think even in fictional versions of historical time periods, I also have mixed feelings about that. So like, quick example, Bridgerton, very popular. I did not like it at all.
That's fair. I agree.
Oh, I had so many mixed feelings, and I think one of the worst things for me, obviously as a white person, my opinion's not the most valid, but I disliked how they had racially diverse cast, which would have been fine if they had done the sort of 1997 Cinderella version where this is just history. It's an alternate version.
Sure.
This is just a story they're doing. Great, but then they had like this weird scene where the characters are interacting and they're discussing how in their own generation, like there's a woman alive who like ended racism in this universe by marrying the king, and like that ended it.
Oh, how nice! How good for you!
I just found that very. I have many issues with Bridgerton, but that was one of them. I thought that was just kind of
I didn't know that.
Minimizing that.
Oh wow. Okay. Wow. That's illuminating. Okay. Yeah. It's interesting because that's one side, but also like I mean there's some level where it's okay, and there's some point where you're just making up a history and you're not using a real historical character, and that's completely different. That's another kettle of fish kind of thing. Doctor Who does this. I love me some Doctor Who, but man, sometimes when they go back and like it's Doctor Who, it's supposed to be all ages, so you tend to get the Sesame Street version of history when Doctor Who goes back to a time period. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting.
Yeah,
but I love me some Doctor Who.
I agree. That's very different than, for example, Bridgerton, which was aimed at adults, and they brought up the conversation just to kind of dismiss it and minimize it.
Yeah.
Wasn't a fan of that.
Yeah. I would argue Bridgerton's adult, but not mature. Yeah. I'm gonna get in trouble when this airs. Yeah. But yeah. I get a lot of pitches from authors locally and away who specifically want to write about their own ancestors, like oh, my great grandmother was awesome, or grandfather was an amazing man, and I'm always really dubious about like that. And I've finally managed to, in the last few years, managed to coalesce my thoughts on it, and I've come to a point where I believe that average people exist.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe there's ever been someone who was great who wasn't also terrible. So don't tell me your story about how your great grandfather was great, literally, unless he was also in some way terrible, because I'm gonna assume that it's just a fluff piece, if not. You know what I mean?
I can see that.
Yeah.
And I think what constitutes greatness historically is very different than what we would call it.
Yeah.
So, in my opinion, I don't think, like Alexander the Great conquered a lot of places, and on paper it's like, oh wow, that's impressive, but in reality, that's a dictator taking over countries and spreading war for his own thing.
And that's also bygone era where the word great meant something real different. You know what I mean? Like kind of like the word awesome has lost all meaning. Like the word awesome is supposed to mean you are looking at a god and your eyes explode and your brain melts because you weak human can't contemplate what you're doing. So I'm like, really? Awesome? That skateboard's awesome. That skateboard made your brain melt and now you're dead. Really?
Yeah.
Oh, we're gonna get in so much trouble for that answer. Good. That's wonderful. It's always good when there's something that you're gonna get in trouble for.
Yeah.
Hannah Jenkins, have you ever read anything that made you think differently about fiction, like as a concept?
I think this is gonna be just exactly what we're talking about. To an extent, coming into contact with historical fiction makes me question where I stand on what should and shouldn't be fictionalized.
Sure.
So coming into contact with things that like this is about Elizabeth the First, but it's a fictional reenactment, and we had no sources. We didn't talk to any historians. We didn't really do our research. And it's just like the aesthetic of that era, and there's characters who don't really exist in real life or something like that. So I think coming into contact with that made me question and kind of get the maybe strong views that I have now about certain things. Strong and mixed opinions. I think some people do it really well, but there's so much respect and there's so much research and so much care that needs to go into writing something that you are not familiar with, whether that be historically or from a different group of people or a different culture. Like, we are not almighty figures unless you're creating your own fictional universe. You can do whatever you want. If it's rooted in reality, then we are not all seeing beings. We need to consult with other people who know better.
Yeah. At the same time, like, and this is not me defending it or like being like that. Historical fiction, like, we didn't call it that, but it's existed for a very, like, in some ways, like, some of Shakespeare's histories are just historical fictions, like the early, like Julius Caesar. What I find interesting is those stuff that people don't, and but you probably do, but like people out in the world don't know. Like, Julius Caesar is a Shakespeare play, but everyone knows that Julius Caesar was also a real person, and that there's some truth to that play and some fiction, and it's one of his histories. You know what I mean? Almost nobody I talk to remembers that Macbeth was a real person.
I did not know that.
Yeah, Macbeth, there weren't witches. There wasn't any of that crazy stuff. But everyone remembers Macbeth for witches and intrigue and, oh no, someone killed my father and all this and all that. You know what I mean? That stuff. He was a real person that Shakespeare was just making up stuff about. Like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if I retold his story, but with witches and with all this crazy shenanigans? That would be fun. And now all anyone remembers is the made-up version, which is like if in 100 years, the only thing anyone remembered about Abraham Lincoln was that he fought vampires.
Yeah.
That's what that's like.
That's wild. I went through high school and almost the entire English degree, and I've never studied Macbeth. Like, I've never even read it.
But even if you did, they would absolutely neglect to be like, so this is a real story. None of this happened in it, but it.
That's insane.
It's so crazy. Yeah, I have fun sometimes imagining like what the stuff we're writing today will have an effect on the future. Like what if you write something so popular that it comes to define literature in this era, and all other literature kind of gets lost to time. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we have a lot from turn of the century, like Mark Twain, that era, but we definitely don't have all of it. We don't even have every episode of Doctor Who, and that came out post television. Like, there's so much fiction that we've just lost to time because it wasn't the most popular. Like what if all other fiction goes into the dustbin and all we're remembered for is Twilight?
Yeah.
Which would be fine. It'd be wonderful.
There are worse books.
There are. I have absolutely read them. Yes, absolutely. It wouldn't even, like, if I was ranking all books like in a stage of like 1 to 100, and like the top 100 were good, like, percentage point wise, it wouldn't even be in my bottom 50%. Like, it's a good, competent book, Hannah Jenkins, what is your favorite childhood book? Your book from childhood that you read? Switching.
Yeah. I loved Harry Potter. I wasn't allowed to read it until later on in my childhood, more like the late childhood, because I grew up like very religious. So I think it took my parents a while to like understand what kind of witchcraft was occurring in it, and like,
sure.
that it was more of the fantasy magic sort of thing, as opposed to like.
Did they get on board once they realized it was actually a Christ allegory?
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't know that. Yeah, I actually remember like there being a book in our house about like finding the Christ in Harry Potter or something like that, and like
Fun.
So there is definitely a lot of religious allegories in Harry Potter. Yeah, and I really love that. I think the older I get, the more I criticize it as a series.
Sure.
But it definitely holds a place in my heart as like that was one of the first things that I loved in terms of literature. I also really liked anything that was Scooby-Doo related. I was obsessed with Scooby-Doo. So like all the TV shows and movies, but also all of the like terrible like books that were kind of based off of episodes that you'd already seen. So like, why are you reading it again? Like the novelizations, but they're all like 20 pages and mostly images. I had all of those too. I had so many.
It's amazing. I love it. I love it. Perfect answer. Yep. Hannah Jenkins, what is your favorite underappreciated novel? If you have ever read something that like you love it, but you feel like no one else has even heard of this, what's wrong with you people? Why haven't you read this? And you can't say Harry Potter again because dear Lord.
No.
Yeah, no.
I really can't. That's a very popular book series.
Yes.
I'm trying to think of little known books. I'm up until like a couple years ago, I would have said The Song of Achilles, but that's actually gotten really popular recently, and I'm glad because it's a great book, and I recommend it to absolutely everybody. Yeah, I find a lot of things that I read either are already popular or they're great and they become popular.
Sure.
So it's hard to be like, y'all need to appreciate this book, because honestly at the moment not a lot's coming to mind that doesn't have at least some sort of a dedicated fan base.
Sure.
Whether that be kind of underground or not, they at least people appreciate it, you know.
Sure. And that'll come, honestly, like the more you kind of go into the publishing world, the more you'll be like, oh, I'll try this book. Why isn't everyone reading this book? Because you'll meet someone and they'll be like, I'm a writer too. Why haven't I heard of you? Well, you know.
Yeah, I'm anticipating that.
Yeah, for sure. Hannah Jenkins, does writing energize you or does it exhaust you? When you sit down to write, or do you come out of it with like, ooh, all this energy, I'm gonna go get the day started? Or is it something where it just like saps everything from you?
I think for the most part, it's very energizing. It's especially when I get like, it's a mood where I want to write and it's kind of flowing out. If it's something like I have a deadline, I don't know what to do. Yeah, that's frustrating more than anything. But if I'm really like letting myself kind of go with the flow, figure things out, like not stress myself out about it, it's wonderful. Unless there are exceptions, if something's particularly dark or something, then that can be very exhausting, but it's also very rewarding if you're handling it correctly. So there are definitely some things that I've written about that are more traumatic or more depressing, but I think they're important to talk about. So even if in the moment it's emotionally exhausting, you need to take care of yourself and you need to view it with the right lens. It's ultimately still rewarding, even if it's exhausting. So
awesome. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Well, Hannah Jenkins, thank you for coming on the Write Project podcast and answering our weird series of questions. And everyone, check out your work. And everyone that's listening to this should check out your work in Mythology from the Rock, as well as The Birds Come Back in Spring.
Thank you for having me. It was very fun.
Okay, excellent.
All right, well, thanks for coming on again. For all of you, we'll be here again next week at 4:30 Newfoundland time or online at chmr.ca. Please tune in and we'll talk more about writing culture in Newfoundland.